joining for our second seminar in the series. We're thrilled to have Ampu presenting and Gary discussing. And so the structure will be, we'll have 25 minutes of presentation, uninterrupted unless you have clarifying questions. And if you do have a clarifying question, you can type clarifying and then your question in the Q&A. And then we'll have 10 minutes of discussion from Gary, and then we will have 25 minutes remaining for Q&A. And for the Q&A, we want to make it as interactive as possible. So please raise your hand, and we will promote you to host so that you can ask your question yourself and unmute yourself that way. So I think we're ready to go. Thank you so much again. And the floor is all yours, Ampu.
Can you see my slides? All right. Thank you very much, Robin, for the introduction, and later Liz and Kiara for your leadership and entrepreneurship and strategy interest group for putting together this timely seminar series. And thanks for also inviting me to present here. And thanks also, Gary, for being my discussant today, and I very much look forward to your comments. I'm going to present a paper today titled Implications of Priority Access in Market with Experts, Evidence from Online Marketplace Lending. My name is Anparasan Mahalingam. I'm a PhD candidate from Purdue University. This is a joint work with Mohammed Alyakoob, a recent Purdue PhD graduate, now an assistant professor at University of Southern California Marshall School of Business, and Mohammad Rahmam, an associate professor at Purdue. In this paper, we focus on platform-based organizations and online entrepreneurial marketplaces. However, our focus is in the nexus of two of the issues that have animated and captured the attention of strategy scholars for a long time. First, governance choices managers make at the corporate level. Second, knowledge and expertise of the market players. So let me start with the first one. Whenever the market design is a possibility, we want to take a step back and ask questions. While caveats apply, by and large, strategy scholarship has paid relatively limited attention to what is known as market and mechanism design revolution that has proliferated for about 20 to 30 years in economics and computer science. And I believe it is for the right reasons. For example, most part of the mechanism design literature has focused on the markets such as school choice, or kidney allocation, or stable marriage. They are not exactly the kinds of markets usually capture the attention of strategy scholars. However, the digital transformation in the recent years provide an opportunity for platform owners and managers to design and deploy their marketplaces and orchestrate the complementary participation in them. So whenever market design is a possibility, as Alvin Roth said, it is natural to ask how the design of the marketplaces influences the functioning of the markets. We know from our emerging platform literature that all actors in the platform, owners and complementers on both sides, need to align well for a specific value proposition to emerge and materialize. Here, how do we account for the manager's ability to use governance mechanisms to achieve desirable outcomes? Second broader point is that platforms intermediate two sides of the markets with heterogeneous levels of knowledge and expertise. There's an ongoing conversation on to the extent to which the expertise matter in the digital spaces. A lot of it is about the trade-off in the sense that how does the expertise compare favorably or unfavorably to the collective intelligence of the crowds? Answer is, as in many cases in strategy literature, it depends. However, much less is known about the congregation of experts and non-experts together in the platform markets impact the performance of the relative complementors. For example, as I indicated earlier, if the platform owners use available tools to them, they may end up tipping the balance towards some complementors, depending on the level of expertise. So taking all these together, I see two important gaps in the literature. First, how to unpack the possible platform governance mechanisms and identify differential effects they may have in organizing the platforms and in the performance of the complementors. Second, how to more nuancedly understand the interplay between platform governance and the level of expertise of the complementors. More narrowly, in this paper, we focus on answering the following question. What are the spillover effects of platform owners providing priority access? Priority access here is a manifestation of platform governance to supply-side expert complementors. Particularly, how does priority access perhaps create lemon-type markets for the same supply-side non-expert complementors, even when they have similar level of information about the demand-side complementors on the other side? So use of platform governance tools vary. Some of them are similar to, the well-known classical corporate strategy tools, such as ownership structure, allocation of decision rights, input-output controls. Then there are others such as platform market access, meaning platform owners' ability to provide access to the marketplace depending on their interest is a new form of government tools available in these markets. Market access manifests in different ways. There is an extensive legal discussion on the access challenges that come from the lack of separation between the platform and the commerce that happens on the platform. For example, should large corporations who are platform-based be considered similar to railroads, or are they part of the platform organization's inimitable private property that may provide them with some distinctive advantage? From a more strategy, entrepreneurship, and organizational perspective, it leads to questions regarding how platforms may use access as a lever of influence and platform weapon of competition. Let me give you some examples. Startups backed by Alexa Fund often get unique access to Amazon Marketplace. Facebook denied API access to perceived competitors. One particular example is this Wine, the Twitter-on feature that let users create 6-second videos. Another interesting example is Google deprioritizing Yelp search results after the proposed acquisition of Yelp falling through a few years before. Another common manifestation of maneuvers in market access is the access for data contracts. You share your data for free, and in lieu of that, you get free or heavily discounted platform service. Google search, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all are known examples for this. To give you a broader example, Kamala Harris and Ted Cruz are powerful politicians and powerful senators from very large states in the United States, from political orientation and persuasion, perhaps as further as possible from each other. However, you could see both in these tweets, in essence asking the CEO of Twitter for access. In Kamala Harris's case, asking for the restriction of access on President Trump, and in Ted Cruz's case, asking not to prioritize access for what he calls snarky leftists, making fun out of it. So all this is to suggest platform market access is a very serious issue for strategists to consider and ponder upon. As I mentioned earlier, we focus on priority access in this paper. Priority access refers to platform owners' ability to provide some subset of complementors with a preferential treatment in terms of access to the marketplace. There are several different reasons for platforms to do. For example, platform might want to bring some established players to increase the legitimacy of the platform. Platform owner often solves demand-side bottlenecks by providing preferential treatment for a portion of supply-side complementors. The diagram here below just illustrates the priority access. Priority access could be in demand side, it could be in the supply side, or perhaps even in both. But in our paper, we focus on the supply side priority access. This slide is to just give some examples on priority access. There are several and in wide range of industries. They include Didi Chuxing making exclusive deals with local taxi companies in ride-sharing industry, Airbnb making agreements with boutique, hotel, and condo developers in the hospitality sector, and American Express providing exclusive offers for Delta Airlines in their credit cards. Before I go any further with the logic, let me give more details about the context of the paper. Online peer-to-peer lending. It is well suited to study the interplay between platform governance and expertise of players. And let me highlight some distinctions here. These debt crowdfunding platforms came into action a little over a decade ago to match potential borrowers with lenders who are willing to provide them with credit. It was established with the initial focus on small individual retail investors seeking to participate in the personal loan market. There are two major players in the United States, Lending Club and Prosper Marketplace, and both together represent a large chunk of the market. And here is how the process works. Platform assigns a grade for each borrower based on the attributes. Platform owners have information about the borrowers similar to what a bank would have on the borrowers. You know, the credit score, debt to income ratio, annual income, home ownership, delinquencies, and plethora of more. Platforms use this to put borrowers into different buckets of grades A, B, C, and others. Initially here, all the loans on the platforms are fractionally funded, meaning that each loan would be funded by multiple investors, with each investor usually investing on average between, say, $50 to $250. This approach was quite ideal for retail investors who generally had small amount of investing capital and seeking to diversify their portfolios. Also, most of these loans are either consumer or small business loans, and typically either for 3 or 5 years, and less than $35,000 US, and it is unsecured. It is linked to the borrower's credit score though, so it provides protection similar to what a bank would have with the unsecured loans. Yet in short order of time, these platforms grew very fast. The rapid growth of the platforms led platform owners to pursue institutional investors to sustain the borrower demand. The institutional investors here mean the usual suspects: investment banks, pension funds, hedge funds, private equity investors. To fulfill the demands of institutional investors, Lending Club introduced what came to be known as priority institutional loan market in October 2012. Institutional investors had more investing capital and their needs could be met by purchasing a large portfolio of whole loans. Now, Lending Club is in a bit of a fix here because they want their peer-to-peer model to succeed. Yet they also want to fulfill the borrower demand and growth. So they came up with the following plan. To make sure all retail investors still have equal opportunity in the platform, they decided they will randomly allocate loans for both newly formed priority institutional loans market and the retail loan market in same quality, which is determined by the grades of the loan. If the loan is allocated to a priority institutional market, institutional investors are provided with a short window of time for about 12 hours, and they need to fund that loan in full amount. Now, if the loan is not funded, that whole loan will become available for purchase in the standard fractional retail market. So here the platform re-emphasized again that retail investors are and will always be the heart of Lending Club marketplace. Now we are going to study how did that work out for the retail investors. When you really look at the retail players, priority access change here. To summarize, the loan is randomly allocated by grade to either retail market, shown in the pink region, or to the priority institutional market, shown in green and blue region together. Blue region indicates that the loans that are not picked up by the institutional investors and reassigned to the retail market. Let me go to some logic here. There is some good work that suggests that competitive intensity with varying quality of players leads to information and transaction problems in platforms. In a broader finance research, we know the documentation that reduced competition helps institutional investors to do quick search in the market and fast track the process of information acquisition for their transactions. Delays in execution due to search concerns account for about 1/3 of the total cost institutional investors incur in the investment process here. So the extensive priority access offered by the platform to the institutional investors help to reduce the intensity of the competition for them, but it increases the competitive intensity for the crowd investors. So this leads us to hypothesize that higher the level of priority access granted to the experts by the platform owner, the intensity of negative spillover effect on the crowd investors will increase. Now let me highlight the implications of institutional investors' ability to selectively pick the loans. A known market failure in the design markets is that competitive pressure on the suppliers may lead them to focus on the high demand customers, otherwise known as cream, and leave the low demands one underserved or completely unserved. AT&T not serving rural areas might be a good example. This is noticeably prevalent when the supply side has limited incentives or obligations to satisfy different types of customers. So the sellers may ignore the skimmed high cost, low profit market segments, even if the long run marginal cost is lower than the price charge. Well, the opportunity cost of serving the skim market may not be worth to spend the firm's resources and investments on. Or even if the firm opts to serve the segment, they might make themselves vulnerable to the other competitive players, including the potential new entrants, who may cream skim the market and peel off your own customers. So this effect is particularly observed in regulatory intensive industries such as financial markets, health insurance, education, telecommunication, cable television, utilities, and airlines. So where does this lead us to? In the financial market, institutional investors devote resources to accurately gauge the future payoff, and that can lead to adverse selection problems for the rest of the investors. The difference here in our setting is that platform governance in the form of priority access does that for the institutional investors. And that leads to the unmet demand from the sample allocated to the experts, directed towards the rest of the pool. While there is no obligation for retail investors to fund the loans recycled from the institutional market, if these retail recycled loans are systematically inferior, and if the retail investors do not incorporate this information into the decision-making process, it can lead to adverse selection problems of the retail investors. So this leads us to hypothesize and suggest that cream skimming by the experts will lead to same-side negative spillover effects on the payoff of the crowd investors, and increased exposure of the residuals of cream skimming by the experts leads to higher same-side negative spillover effect on the crowd investors. I already detailed the online peer-to-peer lending context, so let me get straight into the data and methods. We get the data scraped from APIs in Lending Club platform and supplemented with loan and note sales details on the Lending Club's SEC filings. We use the time window of October 2014 to December 2016. We enter data in December 2016 to make sure that we incorporate last scheduled payment is up to date at the end of 2019. And we use two dependent variables, the rate of return and default. These are commonly used metrics to assess the performance by the investors. And we use four explanatory variables. The initial listing status, meaning whether the loan is initially assigned to the institutional investors or the retail investors. And we use proportion of priority institutional loans to measure the ex-ante priority access provided by the platform. Loan rejected by the institutional investors and the proportion of loan rejected by the institutional investors are used to identify the effects of cream skimming by the institutional investors. We also use a bunch of controls here to alleviate any systematic variation that may come from the quality of difference among the borrowers. Before I get into the main results, I want to show you some sanity check here on the randomization. Lending Club states in their legally binding SEC filings that they do randomization, yet still we wanted to quantitatively verify this. We find that there is no systematic variation between the loans earmarked for the retail and priority institutional markets when you control for the grade by the time fixed effects. These 6 columns in the main table represent our main results. All of them show the effect of priority access on the retail market. The first 2 columns discuss the effect of ex-ante level of priority access measured by the proportion of priority institutional loans. And the columns 3 and 4 shows the effect of cream skimming by the institutional investors measured by whether the retail loans come from the original assignment by the platform or the rejection by the institutional investors. Column 5 and 6 also shows the effect of the level of cream skimming measured by the proportion of retail loans by the institutional investors in the retail market. In all these specifications, we find that in the retail market, default rate increases and the rate of return decreases, perhaps consistent with our hypothesis. These are statistically and economically significant results as well. We do a range of robustness checks and supplementary analysis. They include falsification tests for priority institutional loan markets, results for different windows of time, studying the changes in time to fund the loan, also some simulation results to identify which type of investors get affected by this change. But for the interest of time, I'm going to skip all of them here. So to conclude, what are the key takeaways here? First, we show that why platform governance mechanisms matter. Our analysis shows that how seemingly innocuous market design choices may lead to lender-side, which were done to assess the importance of lender-side expansion, can create entire enchilada of problems for the platform markets and for the owner and the complementors. So it is important for us to identify, as corporate-minded entrepreneurship scholars, to pay attention to these nascent markets. Second, we suggest that the understanding understanding the interplay between platform governance and knowledge and expertise heterogeneity is critical to make platform-based business models to work and succeed. In one variation, we show priority access combined with expertise can create lemon markets, even when all the lenders have similar set of information. So the kind of a thing institutional investor usually has to do to succeed is in effect provided by the platforms with their hammer of platform tools here. And conversely, you could also take it as how platform governance tools can be effectively used to design and facilitate the marketplaces as well. Finally, we also discuss the implications for corporate strategy and platform governance. Platform market scope and boundaries are determined by the type and the amount of complementors participating on the both sides of the market. We hope our paper contributes to this emerging discussion on how to link the corporate strategy, focusing on governance mechanisms with the emerging platform markets and entrepreneurial markets. That's all I got for today as of now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ampu. Actually, you finished, I think, 2-3 minutes ahead of schedule. So now it's time for Gary to share his screen. Can you share your screen, Gary? Perfect. And then we'll take the questions in the chat.
Hi, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, good. And hopefully you can hear me now. Great. So thank you, Chiara, Liz, and the SNE division for organizing this. I think this is such a great initiative. I really appreciate it. And very much thank you, Anpu, for the opportunity to read this paper. As you'll see in a second, it's an area that I'm very excited by. And so I really enjoyed reading the paper, and I'm happy to discuss this offline. So with that, let me jump straight in. There's much to like about this paper. I think that first and foremost, it really does highlight the role of the platforms. For those of us who are interested in strategy, we have a large body of work that looks at behaviors on platforms. And I think what this paper does, and it joins a few other papers, is it highlights that the platform themselves have strategic role and play an active role in shaping the nature of these interactions. And I think this is a very important thing to look at. He also specifically looks at how different governance choices really do then affect the nature of the realized transaction on these platforms. didn't necessarily come up as much in the talk, but was very nicely argued in the paper, that every one of these platforms faces this difficulty of, on the one hand, growing the pie, having more and more participants, and on the other hand, curating the platform in such a way that they get the right type of people in, so that you don't just have lots of people, but you have people that can that are likely to be interested in each other and transact. And I think that there's this fundamental tension that those of you who are interested in platforms, transaction platforms, marketplaces, whatever name you use, this is an inevitable tension that we really do need to understand more about how this plays out. And this paper does a very nice job at touching on a governance policy that was affected by this tension. And so I think this is literally a sentence that Anpu mentioned earlier. It studies the interplay between these governance level choices by the platform, and how does that then affect the patterns of behavior among heterogeneous, and they'll talk about expertise. So participants that differ in their level of expertise. Very rich data. I don't know that you fully described it, but this is a fine-grained, loan-based, week-by-week data that is very nice. There's an opportunity to do a couple of quasi-experiments that I'm not sure are fully exploited right now, but again, just the setting as a whole lend itself very nicely for some really rigorous analysis. I like the methods, Anpu touched a little bit. What I like about their approach is they don't just make assumptions, they do some sanity checks up front to check that the data does behave in a way that underlies the hypothesis. Then they do the tests, and then they have a vector of a falsification test, which is great. And they have this really interesting finding of, they call it cream skimming, this negative spillover, that the presence of institutional investors under this priority approach really does give them a preference. So there's much to like here, and I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but let me maybe just give you a quick premiere of peer-to-peer lending. So for me, I was actually quite interested in peer-to-peer lending for over 12 years. What you see over here is basically the slide that Chris Larson, the founder of Prosper, presented in my class 12 years ago, back when the term crowdfunding did not exist. And what we talked about was eBay for lending. You might be able to see that. And the point that he made was that these are loans funded by multiple bidders. So directly the logic of retail peer-to-peer lending that, that Anpu was alluding to. If you then move to a slide deck that Renaud Laplanche, the founder of Lending Club, the platform that Anpu is analyzing, has articulated a few years later, he actually explicitly says that it's probably a more heterogeneous set of investors, including those institutional investors. So not just the retail investors, but also more deep-pocketed investors. And this is in part reflected in the ability of the platform to grow the scale of its operation, which is so critical to this tension that we talked about. Now, there are a couple of things that I would like to emphasize. I see time is running out, but maybe let me take a detour to dating platforms. And the reason that I'm talking about dating platforms is not because of those platforms per se, but to highlight the point that platforms might differ. What Match.com, that is apparently targeted to the over 50-year-old, offers in terms of participants and interactions might be different than what beautifulpeople.com, apparently there's such a website, offers for the look-obsessed individuals. And so maybe one point that I would like to emphasize is that as we have this growing body of literature on different platforms, it would be very helpful to start each study by articulating the boundary condition of the platform being studied. And that boundary conditions can be in terms of the offerings that are being exchanged. Are they physical or financial? Do they relate to issues that is what being traded associated with common value or private value? It would be interesting to understand what is the nature of the participants and the interactions. Are they heterogeneous or not? Is the matching one-to-one, one-to-many, and so on and so forth? And finally, it would be helpful to understand what's the extent or intensity of different market frictions. And the reason I talk about these boundary conditions is because it allows us to interpret these findings vis-a-vis some results in the literature, some of these which are supportive, some of which are less so. With that being said, let me maybe quickly turn over to the institutional investors. And in the presentation, we were told that institutional investors are expert investors. So they are better at assessing, and we don't really know whether they are better because they have better data or because they have better algorithms. What I would like to suggest to you is not only are they good on those two dimensions, but what is important to remember is that as institutional investors, they come with significantly more capital. And so one of the questions we want to ask ourselves in the lending club context is to what extent institutional investors have better data. Well, to the extent that in this marketplace, everybody sees the same information, it's not clear that that is the differentiation between retail and institutional. Better algorithms, potentially so. And do they have more capital? Well, it's definitely the case they have more capital. This is even salient to the whole loan investment. With that in mind, I just want to kind of double click on this point and remember that Lending Club itself has a proprietary algorithm that creates credit scoring for each and every loan. And so I think that there's room for Anpo and the team to better articulate in what extent is an institutional investor better, more expert than a retail investor that takes advantage of Lending Club proprietary algorithm for scoring. I think there's an opportunity to have a richer discussion of where the expertise comes from. In terms of more capital, well, we know that the institutional investors have more capital. This is why we have this whole loan market. It's also an opportunity to look at an alternative governance choice. When you look at another crowdfunding platform, AngelList, they actually have a syndicate solution that what it allows you to do is to take advantage of the expertise in assessing opportunities, but they only fund part of the deal, leaving the rest of the deal for retail investors. And I think it would be interesting to think about a governance choice that gives the institutional investors 100% of the loan versus one that gives the institutional investors only 30 or 50% of the loan. Why would a platform make those choices? On the issue of access, I think that it's clearly a governance choice. Interestingly enough, when you think about what is the denial of access, it's equivalent to charging an infinite transaction fee. If I charge you an infinite cost for making this transaction, it's akin to saying you don't have access. And I think it would be very interesting for me to understand why would platforms call it a governance choice as a governance choice of access as opposed to a pricing transaction fee. There might be some insights there. Let me jump there. Something very interesting that Anpu has in his study, and I haven't seen in other studies, is the fact that the access is not just a yes/no, it's temporally delineated. And I think there might be some purchase that you can make, at the very least, highlight the novelty of this temporal access decision that I haven't seen in other studies. And this is specifically in the 12 hours window. There's also an opportunity to think to what extent do expert investors, 12 hours a sufficient amount of time to exert the expertise. I have a couple of questions regarding about the hypothesis and thing. I'm mindful of the time, so let me maybe make a couple of points. In hypothesis one, Anpu and the team are arguing that experts will be better than the crowd. But we all know an interesting study by Ethan Mollick and Ramananda that actually has the opposite finding, that the crowd is at least as good, if not better, than experts. For me, this is a great opportunity to go back to the issue of boundary conditions. To the extent that what we're talking about here are loans with common value, returns, whereas Ethan and Ramana were studying art that might be more associated with private value, it gives us a richer way of hypothesizing and understanding different dynamics on different marketplaces. one last point. We talk about priority reduces competition. It is interesting for us to think whether the competition is between the institutional investors and retail investors, or is it amongst the institutional investors themselves? And if it is the latter, to what extent does the priority really does reduce competition? I think I have a set of other comments on hypothesis and analysis. I'll stop there. I'll share it with the Anpu later on. Let me just conclude where I started. I think it's a fascinating study that highlights the role of the platforms and how it interacts with the heterogeneity of the participant on this platform. And I really encourage you to read it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Gary. I would say to maximize the feedback time, I would ask Azim. So I see that there are some questions in the chat. So I will ask Azim to actually ask these questions directly. So he should be able to.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Gary. So Anpu, really fascinating study, and I think I agree with a lot of what Gary just said. I guess two things, and I mean, these are as much questions as as much comments as there are questions, right? So first, I actually think you might be limiting the scope of the study a little bit by making this so much about platforms, right? So I don't think priority access is something that is limited, and this trade-off between giving, some high-value customers priority access versus, being egalitarian and giving everyone equal access and then growing the pie is limited to platforms, right? So, I mean, as I said in my question, well, if you ever sat and watched all the people who are gold card members of Delta board their flight, and then you just sit there knowing that you're not going to get like space for your cabin baggage, right? That's priority access as well, right? But that's got nothing to do with platforms. It's simply a company providing better access to people who are high value customers, right? So I mean, I kind of read through your presentation, through everything. I didn't really see why we needed obviously you're studying a platform, which is cool, but I think the theory applies more generally, right? Where any kind of priority access will have this kind of trade-off. I think the trade-off is very interesting, but I'm not sure why we need platforms here. So that's question one. And question two is, right, so I wasn't entirely clear on whether H2A and H2B are capturing the same thing or capturing different things, right? So there is a version of the story that says, look, the only cost that the retail investors bear is when they invest in loans that were rejected by the institutional investors, right? Which is, I think, is basically H2A, right? And that says we're getting left with whatever the non-cream is. I don't know what the non-cream is, but the skimmed part of the market, and that's going to hurt us, right? But then H2B I think what would be interesting is if you could show that H2B has effects over and above that, right? So even within the subset of the market that has not been skimmed, retail investors make worse decisions if there is a lot of skimming going on. And that might be because of adverse selection, because, basically only stupid retail investors stay on this platform, the smart retail investors move elsewhere, which would be consistent with your sort of story about, platform governance effects. So like, I would really want to see if you limit your sample to only the loans that were not randomly assigned to priority access, do you still see an increase in the default rate, or is it all coming just from the stuff that got rejected, and so on, right? So separating those out would be really helpful. It would also, I mean, I think, otherwise H2A and H2B are basically the same thing, right? Like, because the more priority access there is, the more rejected loans there are, the more rejected loans there are, the more defaults you're going to get to see. And right now you don't test them together, you test them separately. So that would be interesting too. And I don't know if you've tried that, but. That's pretty much all I had. So.
Ampu, feel free to reply to Asim or to anything Gary brought up, and then we can move to the next question.
Okay, so let me take a couple of points both Gary and Asim mentioned that, and I just want to first thank Gary for the detailed discussion and thoughtful comments that you gave. I really appreciate that. And also, Gary is probably the only one that I know, I might have missed some other people, to study in a cross-platform setting in the fintech market, the kind of a market that I care about here. So his insights are exceedingly important and valuable here. So one of the points, Gary, you mentioned is the infinite transaction cost fee and non-pricing strategy. So that's one of the, actually one of the focuses which kind of prompted us to also think about in this direction is, if you look at the old, or not old, like a 15 years old Tirol type of, for the most part, the economics tradition of this two-sided market, most of the time it emphasizes the fact that price is the lever. So, you know, the idea is that, I mean, you give free drink to women to come to club, and then in lieu of that, the rest of us pay the price or something like that, you know. So it's the price is usually seen as the lever to maneuver the market access for both sides. So you give discounted price for the American Express users and stuff like that. So here we wanted to see what are the non-pricing strategies. Non-pricing strategies will also obviously lead us to see about the strategic actions, which are not necessarily price-driven for platforms to take. So that's one of the directions we took, and we tried to link up. So I think I'm glad that you brought that point into your discussion. The second one of the points that you mentioned is the better data and algorithms. So this is something that me and my co-authors were aware of it. In this particular data, we don't know in the lending club whether it was algorithmically funded or versus it just these guys had better data. So that delineation was hard. However, in the sister platform, which also I have done some work on and my colleagues have done work on as well, we know the data for whether this is algorithmically funded or not, certain loans. So we could actually tease out the expert versus non-expert and algorithmically funded versus non-algorithmically funded. So the reason that we stayed away from that in this paper is that we thought it's sufficient enough to make this case, but definitely I certainly see that as an important delineation to make on, in the sense of where does the expertise come from? Is it the algorithm, is it the capital, or is it the data? So I do think that's an important and an extremely elucidating point. The other point about the experts versus non-experts and the boundary conditions that come in different industries, I completely agree with you on this, particularly Ethan Mollick and other kind of work that you mentioned. So in different industries, depending on the context, this seems to flip with the necessary boundary conditions. So we now know in a collective sense, there are a couple of, you need a couple of pointers for collective action or collective intelligence to emerge. For example, if you have some authority figure, or if you could aggregate the information together to make a choice, or if you put together the information in a way that leads to the broader portfolio of work in R or like a developer platforms and stuff like that. So the reason that it doesn't emerge in our platform is that these retail investors, or for that matter institutional investors, don't necessarily coordinate with each other. So the information one has doesn't necessarily, as a retail player, for example, doesn't talk to the other person to collectively build a portfolio of information, which can actually compete against the retail institutional investors. So my hope is that when you try to collectively document these different platforms and in different places, how these boundary conditions emerge, like Ethan Mollick's case, the boundary condition. And in our case that we see actually institutional investors will seem to do better as long as retail investors cannot really aggregate the information together. So I see those as sort of a boundary conditions for how these kind of different contingencies can emerge. In terms of Asim's comment for the first one, I completely share your sentiment. I mean, one of the things that people say is, I mean, when you look at, which I completely agree, is that when you look at a platform data, it doesn't necessarily have to be a fact that you should ask a platform question. Platform data sometimes, for example, the transaction level data that we have is probably for the first time you actually have a very detailed data set about how the loan and financial banking industry works. I mean, you never can get the data within the bank unless you, and even when they give it's a very small, very obscure data sets, if you will. So I completely agree with you on that point. The reason that we wanted to give a platform perspective in some sense, and even though it's not a necessary condition to write this paper, and you could probably scale that up if you will, is that we of course know that, I mean, if you have more people in one side, that can possibly leads to network effect on the other side. And there are some discussion about, you know, all network effects are not good. You know, it depends on the quality. For example, if you have on the same side, on the opposite side, for example, if you have bad suppliers, that can lead to bad demand side outcomes for the players. So demand side players may not participate. What captured our attention, and it was kind of implicit in our work, is that we demonstrate the same side negative network effect, which is prompted by the platform governance, like a strategic action of the firm. So in some sense, I thought through, and I thought that that's an important thing to highlight. But I definitely take your comment into heart, the fact that this doesn't necessarily have to be a platform pointer, and the reason that it became interesting to us as a platform pointer is this is a tool platform is just casually using in wide variety of different settings. So that's kind of the context there. In terms of the second point that you made about 2A and 2B, we did do the analysis for this separating analysis. And I think about it, I have to think much more carefully, and also with my co-authors on this. More I think about it, maybe we might want to carefully do the logic, but I still want to do careful sanity checks on that to see that this actually two different logic, or is it sort of a folded logic kind of way that they have it so far. But I'm glad that you brought this up, and thank you, Osim, for that. That's all I got for now.
Thank you. I have actually an additional question. So it's interesting also, and it builds on what Azim was saying, that the platform made this choice, right? And they've done this for quite some time. So they started in 2012, and I checked their website today, so they're still doing that nowadays. So it seems like they're aware that there are some benefits in doing this, aside from just sort of growing the network, as Gary also showed in his slide. I'm wondering whether you spoke with someone who works at the Lending Club, if you have like any qualitative evidence of, you know, why they're doing this, if they're aware of what they're doing.
Right. So thank you, Kira, for the question. So you raise, and let me scale up your question a little bit. I think that might help me to answer your question. So why do we see a form of disintermediation, or that's right, re-intermediation happening here by the institutional players? My sense is that when these platform-based business models, which were facilitated by mobile telecommunication and internet revolution, gave us the business models which are very successful. So for example, you can bring people who would have otherwise not participated in this platform. This is same with Uber, this is same with Airbnb, this is same here. But the interesting thing is that oftentimes also let the established players out of that kind of a whole space. So what happens, I see at least in this setting and also in a broader settings, is that it brings, it gives an opportunity for institutional players to actually realize that these models are really good and we want to participate in the platform, and there is a certain type of value they could also bring to the platform who is actually doing this one, who left out the institutional players when it started. So in this case, for example, as you said, it continues to, this priority access process continues to work. So and also platform continues to grow without any slowness that we see. For example, now, I don't know the exact number, but it's about from 15 years before to now, about in the US, about 35 to 38% of the unsecured loan market, these players. So there is a need and growth for this process to work. And also they take the re-intermediation fee out, right? So I mean, the platform take a small cut than the banks take. So there's a viability for this success model to work. So that's, so based on our qualitative discussion with these players and also my own understanding about these platforms, is that's one reason that we see this kind of re-intermediation. You don't see it everywhere, but there is a re-intermediation process you could see coming in the platforms as the platforms move from very nascent to relatively stable platforms, if you will. Hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, it also makes me think about, you know, developing a little bit, I guess, what Gary said, also referring to the work by Ethan and Ramana, is that in the end, oftentimes these marketplaces, they promise to democratize, whether it's, you know, crowdfunding or innovation. In this case, it's peer-to-peer lending. But in the end, I think there are some downsides and trade-offs that we don't fully understand. And so I think your paper goes in that direction.
So just to add one quick thing to what you said, so platforms can do both ways. So for example, platforms could bring these institutional players and try to grow and build the platform. They could also oftentimes democratize the algorithmic capacity and the data capabilities they have. So for example, in Airbnb, like a couple of years before Airbnb realized there are hosts who are really experienced, who could price and maneuver the platform very well compared to the hosts who actually don't have the experience. So now they democratize by giving up what is known as the price tip, which is in essence just shows that this is in your place for your house, you probably should charge $80 instead of $60 you are charging or $120 you are charging, and nobody is coming to your platform. So we see both aspects in the sense that a platform also could use decision rights or the kind of a democratizing the rights to players to be able to participate in the platform, which could be large players, or also it could be they could like kind of delegate the algorithmic and other capacity they have to facilitate the platform as well. So we see both.
Great, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Anyone who wants to raise their hand? Okay, I think that's it. Gary, did you have something to add?
No, I think I fully agree with what Anpu has said. I think that there's this richness of choices by platforms. Why, you know, we've focused historically on pricing. There's seems to be a wider set of quivers in there available to them. And I think that going forward, I would like to see people exploring this much more carefully. And this is just a nice first cut at that. I have a few technical questions to Anpu. I guess I'll catch him offline and I'll ask that, but that's about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Anpu. Thank you, Chiara and Robin, for helping to organize, and Asim for your questions. And thank you for all our attendees for tuning in and participating today.